I'd like to first of all ask if anyone in the room is familiar with diabetes. Anyone that you live with or know? Maybe a few. So at a very early part of my career, while I was working at IDEO in the Chicago office, I got to work on insulin delivery devices, which meant that there was, through my design work, I was helping shape someone's behavior around their health, and these kinds of devices were really instrumental in, I think, managing someone's condition. I felt really good about that kind of work, and also felt that's that kind of work I can easily tell my mum about. It's very clear. Also, towards the end of my career at IDEO, I also got to work for this guy. Anyone familiar with who this is? So I was designing packaging for the Kool-Aid brand, which means that I'm helping through design, making someone change their behavior to consume enormous amounts of sugary water. Do you see the problem here? Within my own career, within that span, there's a potential scenario where someone I have worked with or served has now gotten diabetes, who is then being served by the other product I worked on earlier in my career. That's like a loop. So I've, like any positive effect I've got worked on the left-hand side gets negated by the work I'm doing on the right. That's messed up. And I feel like that's the kind of fairly common scenario where you see conflicts of interest pop up in the design field again and again and again. If you're not aware of it, as I wasn't, you may find yourself a little disenchanted when you realize that. So I'm here to perhaps let you know that this is very, very common. The idea of can we do this work seemed to always precede the question of should we do this work. The can we was always based upon availability, budget, resources, who could do this work in the time. But the should we part, I felt, came always kind of late, if at all. And I see that those two things are definitely not the same. Do you guys see the difference? I felt very powerless to say anything when I made those observations. It's a lot clearer to me now, having left the studio, but as an industry as a whole, I find that that type of clarity was not present to me. I felt very powerless to change anything because I felt like if I said something out loud, I would look like I'm crazy. If I said anything, I might actually jeopardize my future career. And if I say anything, I look like I'm some sort of pompous ass, making a moral judgment on everybody else. And the reality is that they all know also, but nobody is saying anything. So this isn't a critique about IDEO per se, but rather a critique of the industry as a whole. What we've come to realize is that there's a certain numbness that sort of afflicts us as working professionals because you're so busy doing the work, so busy getting the projects, so busy getting paid, that the things that we used to think, that seems weird, or like that observation, like, that doesn't seem to add up, you've kind of neutered out, squashed, perhaps dialed down. And I'd hate to think that that might happen to you. So as students coming out of school, you're still very sensitive to a lot of these issues. And your numbness may set in over time. I'd love to make sure that that doesn't happen to you, because it took me a long time to wake up to it. So in 2011, my co-founder and I started a company that we call Greater Good Studio, so that we would never feel like I did, where I could notice something and not feel ready to speak up. I wanted to create something whereby the very act of having our business allowed for a culture where everyone can speak up. So our team can say the same things that I couldn't feel like I could say. We also wanted to make sure that it was clear by our name called Greater Good Studio that there was no discrepancy between the work we publicly talked about in the social sector and the work that we actually did in our studio. It would have been, frankly, a lot easier just to have done this, which is called Incrementally Better Studio, which is the kind of business that I see many other firms having, where sort of when it's convenient, we'll do social sector work. When we don't have anyone being busy, we'll do social sector work. Or if we'll donate it as a gift, we'll do social sector work. That would have been significantly easier of a business model than the one we had, which is a nightmare, trust me. And thankfully, over the last 6 years, we've now built our business to be 10 full-time staff. We have real salaries, real benefits. It's a real business, and it's terrifying to me because trying to make payroll every month is a real thing. But we have aligned, I think, maybe the best team I've ever had in my career. We call them pissed off optimists because it's the unique special ability to be upset enough about the world to see like we should do something, but to still remain optimistic to think that we could do something about it. So that balancing act is very tough for us to find. I suspect there's probably a bunch of pissed off optimists in this room right now. What we found, though, is that by creating this culture and in trying to make sure it actually happened where people felt comfortable to do so, we had to have a mechanism that didn't rely on how I felt that day, what our bank account looked like, what we were doing at the end of that quarter, who was in the room, or whether or not I had coffee. What that meant was that we had to have something that operationalized our culture, something that would ensure a criteria or a rubric around how we chose our clients. Because if we don't say something at the right time, it feels too late, and then you're often doing the project that you know you shouldn't have done. So operationalizing our culture required us to simply write down what we called a gut check, the stuff that you already have in your guts. We called it the gut check because it was just our guts, basically. We just went, oh, I feel funny about this project, or I'm not sure why I don't want to do this project, or something about this client is making me feel weird. And those feelings are very easily susceptible to influence. Like I said, coffee, whether I had a good workout that morning, if I had a good night's sleep, all those things can influence how you feel. So unless you write it down, perhaps even publish it, and make it known and explicit, those things go under the radar. So all our projects go through this gut check, and we had to write it down and actually publish it. We actually were so terrified of publishing it, we thought, oh my God, who are we going to piss off? And then realized, oh, we're just pissing off the people that were never going to call us anyway. It's fine. So by writing it down, we realized that there is actually a rationale around when we say no to things. So when we turn down clients, when we turn down opportunities, we have a professional way to say no, which otherwise you end up sounding kind of like an amateur. You go, I don't really know if I want to do this project. And it sounds just as whiny as that. Whereas if you say, it looks like we may have missed the opportunity to have the conversation we should have had a year ago. What you need is something that we can't provide, but we have many people that we know of in the industry that could do this work. We respectfully decline, here are some recommendations. I've now had to write that email about 17 times. It's awful. It's like the worst breakup email ever. It's not you, it's me, I'm really sorry, it's awful. But to do so, and have regular practice, requires a certain constant vigilance, which is why the gut check is so handy. So despite us actively trying to put ourselves out of business, we now have managed to build up an interesting roster of clients who we've worked with for the last 6 years, about 50 different engagements over this period. Some of them have been tiny, small organizations that are right next door to us, all the way up to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, who is America's biggest health-focused foundation. And we're incredibly happy and pleased that the clients exist, that they're curious enough about what we do, and have been able to find a way to thread the needle through what is essentially a very tricky business scenario. What we found is that the reason we've been able to find these clients is because we've been able to use almost like a Mad Lib to frame projects. We use this very simple sentence construction. We want blank to blank. The first blank is a person or group of people to now blank a new behavior. It's very, very simple. If we cannot get clarity around the who and what the behavior is, we stop the conversation right there. If the person that you're trying to solve for is someone that has enormous resources and is being served by all these other design students, all these other services, I feel like that's probably a good reason for us not to talk anymore. But if it's somebody that's vulnerable, if someone that's been overlooked, that's been neglected for a long time, we probably have a good shot that we might work together. So some examples of that look like this. We want middle school age children to smoothly transition into high school. Does anyone remember smoothly transitioning to high school? It's a nightmare. So in Chicago, there's a lot of Catholic schools that have a really particular process around how to get into high school. So our work right now is to help create a website that will allow parents, teachers, and students to smoothly transition by finding a school that is a good match for them. Another example, we want adults struggling with weight loss to maintain peer relationships to hold them accountable. What we found is that with the work we did with the YMCA meant that when you meet with your peers on a regular basis, the check-in or weigh-in is one part of the process of staying on top of your weight loss, but actually having peer responsibilities with who you meet with every week actually was the driving factor to whether or not you sustained a behavior change. And then lastly, we want landlords and tenants to treat their relationships with a long-term view. Work that we did with the Metropolitan Tenants Organization in Chicago meant that we found best-in-class examples of tenants and landlords who were treating each other with a lot of respect. So we ended up creating a website that allowed for communication for both parties to feel like they had a contiguous messaging board that didn't feel like it was just messages going into a black hole. So what we found was that by having this gut check and our criteria to define what we worked on, we actually gained power. Going from being very powerless, where I felt like I'm just subject to whatever project is rolling over my desk, to saying no to stuff was a complete surprise that that would be a source of power. I suspect that all of you have a gut check inside of you. All of you have the ability to tell when a project seems off. Has anyone ever started a project you go, there's no way I'm going to make it out alive? Anybody who started a project go, oh, this project just seems kind of funky, but I guess I'm going to do it anyway. Oh, dear God, it's exactly what I thought it was. When you say no to the thing you can detect, it changes your relationship to everything. What we found consistently said the projects you say yes to define your portfolio. That makes sense. But the projects you say no to define your reputation. That is something that I did not see coming at all. If anything, I thought saying no was just going to make us sound as though we're giant bozos to everyone. But it turns out the consistent and rationale behind the no's was repeatable, something we could exercise and actually become known for. All of you have the ability to be able to say no. I don't know if the teachers in the room are comfortable with that statement, but the students absolutely have the ability to say no. I don't know if you've had to exercise it anytime soon. The teachers also can say no to the administration. I don't know if the administration wants to know that. The administration can also say no to the board. I don't know if the board wants to know that. It goes on and on and on. So in that transition from learning to not have power and getting used to it, and then getting power by saying no, I realized that I'm actually really unprepared to talk about this transition. I don't even have the vocabulary to talk about it, but I can tell that there's a difference in how I felt going into these meetings in one setting versus how I feel about them now. It's actually pretty hard, you see, to spot the absence of something, but the absence in my mind was the fact that I didn't have this educational background when I was learning design. I felt like I learned how to solve for problems, I learned to solve for certain things that were sort of complex. I could draw, I could visualize. Those are the skills that I learned in design school. But in design school, you also, what I found, is that there's a gap, a very large gap in understanding how to talk about power, and it may be a gap that extends to other fields as well. So for all this talk about being human-centered, which is certainly the field that I've worked in, this very basic human factor seems to be overlooked, which is how power works within human interactions. One person to another, there is an exchange, a transaction, a flow of power that gets overlooked in classrooms, partly because there's already inbuilt power dynamics in the classroom. As is commonly taught, you see, design does a really good job of getting you to see the world as a series of problems, and that you, in your ability as a designer, is meant to solve them. Actually, that makes a lot of sense. And it's pretty great because this is one of the best careers I've ever had in my life. This is an amazing thing that we get to do all day. The problem is, though, is that when the complexity of the problem you're looking at is so overwhelmingly large, the training you have to treat everything as a simple problem underserves you. So what exactly is the big problem? Well, it's partly because more and more designers are leaving schools just like this and are eager to work on large, complex social issues. If you haven't been noticing the change that we've had in our political scene, you haven't really been paying attention. But the world is completely different than it was even just a year ago. And the desire to help and contribute to that larger conversation is a right that all of us have. But designers, I think, are uniquely suited to tackle that kind of complexity in a way that other disciplines, I think, are not. But this weakness that's dormant in design education means that when we step into these complex scenarios, since we don't understand how power works, we may not realize how much power we were given as a designer, how much power is inherent in us, perhaps being as a man, as a North American who speaks English. All those types of privileges you get as a designer may carry into the projects you're working on. And you may not necessarily realize that the group that you're trying to serve may not see your presence necessarily in the best light. There's a lot of instances of people showing up to communities as a savior. That's very troubling. And while you may not explicitly say, I'm here to save you, the project you're on may have those connotations. So this is a list of about 50 different issues. These are the kinds of topics that I think students are starting to tackle. These are the type of issues that our studio likes to work on. These are nuts. There's nothing, actually it's a really depressing list of issues altogether. But if you look at them, those are the kinds of things that your students, people in this room, will be working on one day. And unfortunately, these do not get easily bucketed and Gantt charted and post-it noted their way through. These are contexts, not just problems. And they took decades to be built and will probably take decades to be undone. They don't casually get treated, and they don't suddenly fit into a semester. So the complexity of these issues cannot be treated the same way like you treat a toothbrush. If you're going to design a toothbrush, design a product, design a service for Starbucks, all those types of things fall, I think, well within the realm of design education today. But this type of work has to be treated differently, has to be treated with a little respect. So I've been talking about power a bunch. Let's see if we can define it. The simplest definition I've found is that power is the ability to affect an outcome. Think for a second. Are there times when you've been able to affect an outcome and you wished it to be true? That means that you probably had a little bit of power. There are probably also others that you know, perhaps parents, family, friends, who can practically guarantee certain things to come out a certain way. That means that they have power too. So in these scenarios, when you have power and you tackle these projects with enormous complexity, this question of can we do something versus should we do something comes up and rears its ugly head again. Is it appropriate for us to be working on this project? Who has done this work before? Who is working on this project right now? And who are you to tell others that you are the one to save them? It's not to say that you shouldn't, but you may be surprised if you get yourself into a complex scenario, show up at a community, and everyone's already pissed at you. You may be wondering, what did I do? I didn't do anything. I'm here with Post-its. I'm here to help. And it could be that you just reminded this community that they are powerless because this project is going to happen anyway, and you were just another cog in this wheel for that mechanism to occur. So with power being defined, what we found over the last several years is that we've started to claw our way towards an understanding. I feel like it's troubling sometimes to think of myself as an expert in this, because I'm not. I'm learning this too. But there are a couple of observations I've had over the last few years around how power affects the projects that we do, and also sort of some general observations. So there are three. The first one, power profoundly affects how you see the world. So I'm going to compare the worldview for people who have a lot of it versus those who do not. The ones who do not may be the people you're trying to serve. If you have a lot of power, you see the world in a different way, whereby the chances of things going in your favor are different, how you plan for things are different, and what your dominant mindset could be different. So those with power, frankly, you get used to the idea that things go your way all the time. If that becomes so reliable, you start getting kind of comfortable planning things out because things have always worked out your way. So when you start planning ahead, you get used to the time scale. So you start planning years, decades, and for some people who have enormous power, they might be planning for their children and their children's children to be set up in a particular way. If you have all of those baseline things covered, frankly, the world makes a lot of sense. It sounds awesome. Doesn't it sound great? Everything works exactly as you expect. So then you become very rational, and you start making plans that seem, no, 2 + 2 = 4. What's the big deal? If you don't have much power, on the other hand, the world is very different. The chances of things going your way tend to be lower. And since you can't rely on that happening the way you want all the time, you start planning things differently. Your time scale changes. By the end of the day, you may or may not have a job. At the end of the week, you may or may not be able to make your rent. At the end of the month, your kids may or may not be still in school. When those probabilities go up, your chances and your scaling factor starts to decrease. And I think it's very hard for people who are used to seeing the world plan out the way that they usually do to comprehend what it's like to have to plan 24 a week or a month out at the most. And if you're in school and you have a couple of years ahead of you before you graduate, somebody, somewhere, probably your parents, have been planning for you. That's amazing. But they have a certain amount of power to know that that could be true. Then lastly, if those baselines of having low probability and your planning scale starting to reduce, you start acting irrationally because you can't trust the world to go the way it should. And what's troubling about this is that those who have power tend to write rules, they tend to write policy, they tend to write research studies that look upon the world of those who have little power and say, these people really need to have a budget. These people really need to plan better. These guys really need to have some help. They seem to be kind of crazy. Not only is it dismissive, it severely underrepresents the gulf of understanding between those who have power and those who don't, because they have a very different life than you. They aren't crazy. They just have a different life. And I think that's something that is hard for some people to understand. The second big observation is that power asymmetry profoundly affects relationships. So I want to help you understand what this means. Power asymmetry. So I talked earlier about ever working on a project where you feel as though there's just no way you're going to make it out alive. That is happening when someone who has more power than you is applying pressure. You are at the sharp end of a power asymmetry from someone who you either maybe directly know, more likely you don't even know, and you don't even know they exist, but they are somewhere. Maybe one or two rings of relationship out. So power asymmetry, I've just visualized as this triangle. But here are some typical power asymmetric relationships. Funders to grantees, employers with their employees, doctors and patients, law enforcement with detainees, teachers and students, we talked about, parents with their children, government with their citizens. In some of these relationships, the asymmetry is mind-bogglingly large. Others, not so much. But I tend to contest that many relationships that you have with your personal life, your professional life, and even just interactions on the street have power asymmetry built into them at different degrees. And when you feel as though you are under pressure, it's probably because someone has asymmetry over you. The third big observation. Power transfer must be explicitly designed. Since I've just established this idea of the power asymmetry being present, when we have power, because we got hired by somebody with more power than us, we are now realizing that we are at the wide end of a project. And someone that we're trying to serve will likely be on the sharp end of us. That's a terrifying, but kind of a slightly unsettling realization once you get to heads around it. And you realize, oh God, how are we not going to screw this up? And what we realize is that unless we explicitly try to design power transfer from the wide to the sharp, we might actually just be reminding everyone again that they're helpless, powerless to this project from happening. A project that we started that we feel incredibly grateful for is from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. It's called raisingplaces.org. We've been writing about our process so far, and it's a project where we were asked to try and see if we can design a child-centered community. And what that means is that we were a grantee of Robert Wood Johnson, and we were working with communities, and we were actually in a position to choose which communities were going to work with us. So if you look at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation on the left-hand side, the wide end, with grantees on the right, we find ourselves about here. That's a place we are not used to being in. We're not typically a funder of anything. We're barely, just kind of making it alive as we go. But we found ourselves in a kind of an awkward spot where we were treated at times almost like celebrities when we showed up to places. We definitely could tell that we had power that we were given, and we had to treat it with a lot of care. What we found is that in the process of applying to the grant that we wrote for Raising Places, we tried to see if the application itself was lightweight, because there are a lot of applications that strip people of power in its transfer. Has anyone ever tried writing an application for financial aid? It's a humiliating experience. You have to literally put down how broke, how decrepit, how deficient you are in all these ways. And if you are crappy enough, awesome. It's almost cruel the way it's set up. I get the mechanics of it, I get the rationale behind it, but it does seem kind of weird to me that you have to prove how low you are in order to qualify for this thing. Somewhat similarly, for applications for grants from large funders, you might have to explicitly bend over backwards to say how needy you are in order to qualify. We felt that that was humiliating. So the application process we wrote was to try and see if you could simply convene a group of your established and emerging leaders in your community, gather up all the assets you have, because we know you have them, and then round up all the challenges you'd like to tackle. That's it. And send in that. We found that the application process was different because of it, and we even had one community write to us to say, we did this process, thank you very much. We found that actually we are not ready to do this project right now. We have other things we want to tackle instead. Thanks very much, peace out. They turned us down. So cool. That's amazing. They had enough power to say, we don't need you. Check it later. Which I think is remarkable. And also fair play. I feel like that's exactly the kind of rationale that we want. That's kind of like feeling we want to produce in the people who are applying. Where if they do want to have help, it's not because they need it, it's because they want it. And they have to opt into a process, which is different than feeling like it's happening to them. We generally found, you see, that people adopt the change that they're a part of making. And unless you can design those moments for that adoption to happen explicitly on purpose, you will find the adoption rate for change will always be kind of low, which is, I think, frankly, the norm. It's the kind of numbness we talked about earlier, where we're so numb to how things typically go. I don't know if people are used to the idea that you could have much higher adoption rates if perhaps the people affected by that change were involved in it. So when you realize that design is a role, which is slightly different than it just being a job, your relationship to power changes. That's something that's very uncomfortable for me because I feel as though I was trained to do this. Isn't that the point of having gone to school? I'm awesome, I'm a designer. I took a lot of pride in that title. And in the slow dissolution of my ego, I'm realizing that actually there's a greater responsibility that the name, that the word comes with. So if design could be this role, not just a job, I feel like I have a different role to play now. So which is why I have to feel like I have to cede power, let go of control, and perhaps give up all sorts of things that will affect my ego. And I'm slowly getting used to that. Last thing, since I realized that this blind spot around power is true, I then had this second wave of terror, realizing, oh my God, what else do I not know? How do we not know what we don't know? I mean, that's a real basic truth. Well, it turns out there is a bunch of things. Being trauma-informed, managing implicit biases that you have, and then your class consciousness are new areas that we're slowly just starting to open our eyes to as an office. And there are many more that we don't even know we need to bump into. But sadly, we are bumping into them and no one's telling us. Just like we bumped into power issues and others. So I suspect that many of you have feelings upon what I just said. We're going to take a break here and take some questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, George. That was a great talk. My mind is just spinning with, all these things that I want to do now. But one thing I was thinking, with respect to all the students that are here, I see that asymmetry of power that you were talking about, and how they, going out, once they finish their design education, how do they enact power in just starting out? They're just the low person on the totem pole. What can they do? What are some of the things that they can sort of exercise in their early careers to kind of get on this track that you talk about?
It's really tough. When you're coming out of school, you are automatically diminished for reasons that have nothing to do with you at all. You are made to feel small, treated small because you are new and because you have legitimately less experience than others. It's a very tough spot to be in. There is a limit, I think, to how much power one can grab or take over or claim without it feeling a little bit silly or perhaps disingenuous. But there is a technique that I've been establishing with my students, because we talk about this a lot in my class, but also as we have certain classes where students are graduating. A method that you already know how to do is to talk to your peers in a particular way. When you talk to your peers, you operate in a way where you look at them in the eye, you listen well, and then give them suggestions on what to do differently. We all know how to do this. When we are going and starting out, though, and particularly as you're starting in your very first job, or even more asymmetric is in a job interview, when you are sort of like this, sitting, and sort of even your posture is affected. When you sit and operate from a place of unworthiness, your questions, your demeanor, your attitude, your very language changes, which is not how you would treat yourself if you're talking to a peer. So it's almost like a mental trick you have to apply. If you treat the person that has more power than you like they were your neighbor, like they're someone you were going to work next to in your studio, like across a desk from you, you would treat them differently. And they can tell. So I would always recommend that if you operate like you do with your peers today, with everyone, it takes some courage, but you will find yourself gaining power in that moment. And they will give you more power than I think you were expecting. But I think the default norm, which is sort of what's so pernicious about asymmetry, is that we can tell when we have power, when we don't have power, and we like fall into a groove. I've joked about this in the past, but I was the youngest of 4 kids growing up in an Asian household. I know how it's made, and like my mum in particular is like a ninja with guilt. So I know how to be made to feel small. I feel like falling into that trap many, many times. And it's a habit that I find myself in when I shouldn't. So I feel like there is these old habits that we carry over from one relationship to another. And the challenge is to kind of treat each relationship like it's new, and ideally treat them like their peers, because I think it's very easy to fall into the trap of feeling small. It's not easy.
That was good.
Thank you.
This is just a continuation, I think, but maybe a slightly different color to the question. But the implicit bias is incredibly difficult to push oneself to identify, and it's another aspect of sort of conventional thinking as we go through our education, and then as we work and our creativity to an extent can kind of fall away to convention. Just kind of accepting conventional norms are so strong, whether they're like in a power structure, as you're referring to, where a client or the people that you typically want to engage with as clients have conventional biases towards what might have been done before or what their peers are doing, and so there's this very difficult situation about sort of pushing back the creative thinking, questioning those implicit biases, and moving back to sort of a pre-educated kind of status of being that creative, that you're going to look at things with a new eye. So I guess my question is, do you have aspects or tricks that you think trigger for yourself in terms of pushing that creativity and pushing against those implicit biases, pushing against convention, and what might they be, and also how would you trigger that with your communication with a client or the people that you're in convincing other people to think that same way, question those. So you're starting from a point of being more creative and questioning things.
So the way that managing implicit biases is sort of framed in a lot of conversations, and partly how I'm framing it now, has been around race and around gender and around other issues around people's identity. And that type of conversation is it's really difficult to have out loud. What we found is that we've done a training in our office now a couple of times, and I think we will continue to do this for forever. But the idea that you may be carrying these biases is something that was unsettling to realize, and realize that I have different ones than my colleague, but that collectively we also have one that is shared as a group. So that was kind of interesting to realize that the personal bias you have may be different than the one that your entire team or staff or group collectively has. So that separation between individual versus collective bias is really tough, because you feel as though, well, I can't control the other one. You can kind of, but you have to call out. You have to call it out when you see it. Firstly, you have to start with your own implicit biases about how people are, about whether it's gender, race, age. I have this odd bias against people who are visibly older than me. Who knew? It turns out that I think I have defer a lot of judgment to those who seem older because of my parents, and because growing up in an Asian culture, you defer a lot of judgment to people who are elders. And that means that I almost unequivocally regard them as with more respect. But if you're younger than me, or at the same age, I could go either way. That's awful. What an awful thing to do to people all the time. God. So I know that I've been trying to become more comfortable with realizing that. As a studio, that can only happen if you all explicitly at the same time talk about what those biases are. Because when you share it out loud and kind of air out this dirty laundry, you realize, wow, we all collectively have these. But then the question is, do we collectively as a whole now have biases against certain applicants who are trying to join the studio, certain clientele, certain people that we're trying to work with? What are the biases that we have against them or for them? Both are basically problematic, because neither is true about that particular person you're going to meet. What we find, though, when it comes to maybe talking to our clients, a lot of our clients, I say on that list, for instance, actually are very, very familiar with this field already. The bias they may have actually is about design. That's a whole other conversation, which is that they may think of design as being a shallow, superficial practice. I think there is rationale behind that. I think there is reason for them to think so. As a field, we celebrate the shallow. We celebrate the superficial. We celebrate things that are fleeting. And I think that our industry heads towards the things we celebrate. So for those who don't know our field that well, they may think that that's the biggest thing on our minds, is to look at the best, flashiest new thing that just popped up on our website. They could be forgiven for thinking that. While all of us may go, no, 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 we really like to treat design with a lot more respect, and we like to treat things with a lot more rigor. But if everybody in our field keeps talking about the thing that is superficial and shallow, and we celebrate it and we give it awards, how are people left to think about it? So what we have to do often is actually play the game of taboo with our clients, where I don't use the word design. I'm not allowed to use design, not allowed to use the word innovation, not allowed to use the word iterate or prototype. It's really hard. So what I have to do is actually listen more and speak much less, and just try to hear, what are they actually doing? What are they trying to do? Have they done it? Have they changed how they've done it recently? Would they like to change how they do it with less risk? Okay, we could help you with that. So it's challenging to talk about your field without referring to it, but I actually think that one of the ways in which you can tell when you are an expert in the field is when you can break it down without ever using those key words. And I think that's a really, really difficult challenge, because I've had to really, it's an easy crutch to just default behind design, innovation, iteration, expand, converge, double diamonds, all those things, all those terms that we teach. It's much easier to get away with that. But to challenge yourself to never use those words means you have to find substitutes that can actually still make sense. That's a very long-winded answer, sorry. Any other questions? Yes, please.
So you mentioned that when we start working in any organization that we should treat each other as a pair, like you're talking to your friend.
Yes.
So how about if it's in an organization where you've got different hierarchies, where obviously when I start working somewhere, some people might have earned their stripes or maybe worked there for 5 years to get to the point at which where they are, and then they might not be open to hearing like a newbie or someone who just graduated. So what is the way to add your own input without being
an asshole? Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's really tricky. Talking as a peer is one thing, but I think also when you talk as a peer, you talk with respect. I think if you talk as though you know something, I think people will quickly find ways to diminish what you've just said because you are new. So I think you can avoid some of the traps that I've seen with people who are new, who are almost so desperately trying to prove themselves that they can come off as being someone who's kind of a bozo. And I think that can be problematic. I think there is a limit to how much one can do. Certainly, if you are ready and willing to speak as a peer, you have to be able to back it up with the work that you're actually doing. So if your results are not showing up the way that I think probably the people are expecting you to be able to deliver, you will quickly get discounted. If you are delivering the results, but not treating yourself as a peer, you actually might be discounting yourself. That's what I've seen a lot of people do. Ideally, you speak as a peer, deliver results, and your ascension in power actually is more predictable. That's what I found to be true. Yes, one more. Hello.
Hi. You told a really interesting story today about your own journey to realizing a lot of these things around power and design. I'd like to see it, and I completely agree with the idea of talking to people like peers. And I hope that I actually live it out more than not. I'm kind of interested to see what you would say about education as an institution, as a more systematic address of some of these issues instead of keeping the focus on the individual. I know it's very tempting. Once you've been designing long enough, there's that cult of the creative individual. How can we take this to a more systemic approach? How can we code this into our institutions, and what are the sources of resistance to doing that?
Oh boy, I don't know if I'm old enough to be able to answer that question properly. Let's see. I've had some thoughts as a person who's been teaching now full time for about 6-7 years, that there is sometimes in the pursuit of professionalizing teaching, we have perhaps forgotten that the modeling of behavior that we do in our daily lives is also a model for teaching. And that because we have now fetishized teaching to be something that can only be done in the classroom, and that everything else that we do outside of our lives is not teaching, there's sometimes a weird disconnect between the things we say and then we actually do. So sometimes teaching, I think, has become its own, obviously it's its own field, its own professional practice, but I think we've compartmentalized it so much whereby we can't teach in any other method. This is true, I think, of parenting as much as it is for college professors. But I think if you try to model the behavior that matches what you've been talking about, you actually will be teaching in all these other channels that are probably quite opaque to you right now. So teachers as a whole, as a field, may struggle with that. I know I do, in trying to be consistent. Looking upon my own youth, I was an enormous liability to my family. I think I've caused them enormous amounts of stress and shame, which is something that only Asian people know how to handle shame in a particular way. We're like really good at it. But it's the kind of thing that I look back on to recognize now, because I feel like I have to model this behavior, not only to who I work with, our peers, to perhaps rooms like this, but also to my kids, because I feel like that's the kind of teaching that actually is much more communicative than the one that we only mostly do in classrooms. Because you have to remember, there was a period of humanity, even proto-humans, when there was no spoken language. There was nothing written down. We only communicated through grunts and how we stood. So if there was a baseline channel for communication that doesn't require language, you have to remember that that is how we primarily learn stuff. That's how children learn for many years before they know how to talk. They just simply watch and observe those around them. So if those actions and those behaviors are communicating on a channel that is opaque to you, you have to open up your eyes to that, because you're definitely saying something. So every action you make, every decision you make, things you turn down, like I talked about, is communicating to a large audience that I don't know if necessarily we pay attention to, because teaching has become such a compartmentalized function these days. I don't really think I answered your question at all, but I did kind of go off on a bit of a rant.
Let's keep trying.
Okay, let's keep trying. Okay, I think that was some really good questions. Oh, there's one more. Yes. Is that okay? Yeah, of course.
I was just curious about what probed you to, what helped you to better understand the different mindsets of power and to want to investigate, like, understanding, okay, someone with a lot of power has these traits, these thought processes, and these behavior patterns, and then someone who doesn't have that, what are their behavior patterns, what is their mindset, and what kind of gave you the desire and to go after looking for those answers?
It was by accident that I got put in a position where I had to think about it. I was at a conference where questions were being facilitated in a room, which is a sneak preview of the kind of stuff we're going to do in a little bit. But through facilitation, I got asked really unsettling questions about my relationship to power. And the one that really did a real doozy on me, which I'm not going to put on you because that's been cruel. This question was, in which situation do you not trust yourself with power? I was like, oh, damn. And it all came suddenly to me that not only do I know specifically when those situations are, it has affected my career over the last several years. Specifically, I have avoided leadership opportunities because I don't trust myself to not abuse the power I was given. I have consistently seen so many of the leaders I've worked for abuse that power that I was so afraid of it happening to me that I just held it at arm's distance, and I've avoided it. And all of that was like clarifying in that moment. And I realized, man, I've got some work to do. I have a lot of self-work I've got to do here. And it was not fun to have to realize that. But it suddenly became very clear. I thought, oh God, what else do I not know about this stuff? So then I explored, and through just simply some self-reflection, which I think all of us is capable of doing, your relationship to power could be revealed, which is a good segue to what we're going to do next. But I'd hate for you to think that my impression of power is somehow a universal, absolute way of it being. That's simply not true. In the same way that our gut check is not a universal all-being gut check. You have your own ones. You have your own relationships to power based upon your own relationships to other people. Probing on it, though, is something that I could help facilitate. So, are you guys ready to do something? Okay, so what I need at this point is we're going to switch gears. We're going to do something called creative tensions. And what that means is we are actually all going to get up and we're going to stand as long of a line as we can behind the chairs along this back area. So can we all stand up? And if need be, maybe push some of the chairs forward so you can have a little more room. Okay, we're going to do this exercise that is based upon this whole room as a spectrum. So I'm going to show a couple of spectrums on the display. The only part that you cannot stand is right in the middle for two reasons. One is, if you stand in the middle, you're cheating. Secondly, you're going to block the camera. So I want you to physically take a position in the room based upon your response to this question. Okay? I prefer to plan, which is this side of the room, versus I like to improvise, which is that side of the room. Can you please move yourself to a relative position with this center line being the area that you cannot stand in? You can be close to the center, but you cannot stand in front of the center. So all of you lot are all planners? You're not moving at all? Really? And you guys, all of you lot are all improvisers. So here's the thing. Your relative position to this is also a statement. Correct? So can I ask the gentleman with the yellow t-shirt? Yeah. You are pretty far over there. What's it like to be a planner? Well, we should give you a mic. Oh, let's speak up. Let's just speak up. What's it like to plan? What do you like about planning?
I like planning because I can know the thing that will happen in the future. So I can know the trail that I'm going to, so I can make sure I am doing better.
Okay, you can like track things.
Yes.
Wonderful. Upon hearing that, does anyone want to change their position? Okay, can I hear from someone, let's say with the blue t-shirt? Could you tell me what's it like to be, I don't know if you're playing along, but can you tell me what it's like to improvise? You are all the way over there. Go with the flow. What do you love about improvising? What do you love about it? Let's speak to the mic. It's flexible. Anybody want to change the position? Okay, so you understand the format of this. This is how it's going to work. We're going to do one more of these. Are you ready? Empathy is a practice or a gut reaction. Please find a relative position in the room. I want to see everybody moving, please. So, a practice, a gut reaction. I'm not asking if which one is true, I'm just asking what is true for you. Oh, there's been some movement, that's good. Oh, there's a lot of movement. That's interesting. There's a whole bunch of people moving. This is great. Okay, so there's a big cluster. This is great. You guys are doing great. Can I hear from, there's a lady with a yellow bag. Hi. Could you tell me why you took your position there? And I'm not going to contest it. It's exactly true as you wish. If you could just tell me what it feels like, where empathy is a practice for you.
Actually, I didn't choose yet.
Do you want to pass it to somebody who has taken a position? Is anybody in the area who's already taken a spot, who feels comfortable speaking? I'm going to make somebody start talking soon. There we go. Striped shirt. There we go. Yes.
No. Can you explain, like, because we really not really understand what practice and gut reaction is?
So practice means that you have to think about it. It has to be conscious, and you have to think, I am going to be empathetic. Versus, I just feel empathetic and I can't help it. Does anybody want to change their position now? Okay, so I just want to hear from somebody from that side of the room. Yes, thank you.
I'm like incredibly selfish, so.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, no problem. But I have to always remember that whoever I'm talking to has feelings and their viewpoint and why they stand for that viewpoint, and it's not just your viewpoint. So really kind of working with them rather against them.
So for you, that's why you've taken that position?
Yeah.
Have you ever been over there?
Not often.
Okay. Thank you for sharing. Now, can we pass the mic? Can somebody on this side of the room speak to the gut reaction that they felt with regard to empathy? Hello.
I just think it's a feeling you get, and you just kind of express it the same way.
How do you know when it's happening?
You just know. I mean, I think it's just it's exactly what it is. It's like a reaction that you get. It's an emotion that you get. And you kind of base on your reactions off of that.
Is empathy different than sympathy? What's the difference? Can someone speak to that? Do you want to put your hand? Oh yeah, Katie.
I feel like empathy is having compassion for other people, and like as a human being, being like generally good and caring for, I don't know, just how other people are. And I think sympathy is if somebody goes through something bad, you're like, oh, I feel bad for what they're going through. Instead of empathy is just kind of like compassion for people in general.
So is your position still stay true?
Yes. I think that people are inherently good and that we find the compassion to like help others, but I think that empathy, that's why I'm closer here, because I think you do have to practice it, but I think it is inherent in human beings.
Okay. Okay, we have one last one. Are you guys ready? Okay. The most powerful actions are taken on behalf of oneself versus others on that side of the room. Can you take a relative position, please? Do you see how they got a little harder each time? They're really annoying, aren't they? The most powerful actions are taken on behalf of oneself or others.
Does this imply more pause or horizontal?
However you want to interpret it. If anyone is unsure about the question, let me know so we can talk about it. So everybody feel, if they're not sure, maybe just ask a partner, say, hey, why are you standing there? Oh, there's been lots of movement. This is great. Katie, where's the mic now? Who would like to speak from this side of the room? Which side are we on now? This is the oneself side. Who could speak for the one? There's a whole cluster of oneselves. Oh, there we go. Hello.
I chose this side because I think understanding ourselves is the kind of like gateway to understanding other people, and so kind of being able to be honest with the truths about yourself is a way to, I guess to me, is like a portal for understanding other people.
That's how you've interpreted this. Anyone want to change the position? Okay, so someone from this side, from the others side, can someone speak to maybe why they took their place, took their position?
Sure. I don't know, just from past experiences, I have done things for myself, and I can always do something for myself. But when I do something for others, I feel so good.
It feels different.
Feels different. Yeah, it feels so much better.
Has anyone heard on an airplane they sometimes say before putting on those little air masks, oxygen masks, you put it on yourself before putting it on children? Does that come into play at all here? Anyone change their position based on that? Okay. You guys were great. So, you are now ready for the next part. Okay? So this was just a warm-up. We're going to do some exercises that are smaller in scale. And what we were doing was we transitioned from me speaking to you as a large group, you speaking to me as a large group, but now you're going to speak to yourselves. Okay? So we're going to be dividing up into small pairs. We could sit down, you could stand, it's okay, but we're going to go to the next part of this. But I want to establish a couple of ground rules about how to be. Is everyone ready? First ground rule, please be observant of how much time and space you take up in the room. Not everyone got the same amount. That's especially true for tall North American white males. Secondly, be respectful when listening. Ask questions only when a clarification is needed, not just to sound smart. I think that's probably good practice anyway. Lastly, remember that you don't have permission to share what comes up in your conversation to the whole room, so please ask first. Okay, so you're going to be having some intimate conversations with your partner next. So if you can break into pairs, please. Find someone that you don't know that well. and you're going to have a conversation with them. If you wish, you can sit back down, you can stay standing, but you have to find a pair. And actually, I'm going to recommend that we kind of spread out. Let's have a couple of people sit back down on these chairs, because the kind of conversation you're going to have, you might want a little privacy around. So take some room. Spread out.
Seems like a good idea to hand off the mic.
Does everybody have a pair yet? We're going to sit down in pairs if necessary. If you don't have a partner, you can always add to a third. That's it. Add into like a group of 3. That's totally okay. So as you're settling into your pairs, maybe introduce yourself, say hi. A 3 is fine. A 3 fine. So, is everyone ready? Okay, let's get our attention together. Okay. So what I'm going to do is going to ask the room to respond to some prompts on the screen, and in your pair or in your group of 3 or however many you have, I'd like you to discuss for a certain number of minutes and then share back to the room what came up. Not that complicated. Are you guys ready?
Ready.
The first one is about power that comes from identity. Okay? Are you guys ready? First question is, what identity do you claim? Second one is, what identity was placed on you? Lastly, what identity did you earn? My answers for this might be, what identity do I claim? That of a professor. I don't have a master's degree, so amazingly I get to teach. It's crazy. Secondly, identity that was placed on me. An Asian man with a British accent. I did nothing for either one of them. Lastly, what identity did I earn? That of an entrepreneur, because I worked my ass off. So all of you will have completely unique experiences and answers to these questions. The challenge is to talk about them out loud. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes to talk about them in your groups. Is everybody ready? I'm going to check back in 5 minutes.
5 minutes each, or
5 minutes total. Thank you. Okay, let's start winding up our conversations. Okay. I'm so sorry I have to cut you off. You guys were just getting going. I'd love to hear what came up for you in your pairs and your groups. Is anyone willing to share? Do we have a microphone still? Oh, yes. Is anyone willing to share? Yes, thank you.
The identity that was placed on me, I have a son that has special needs. He has autism. And so I am a mom to a kid with special needs. I did not choose that at all. But yeah, that was placed on me. And that's part of my identity because I do a lot with him. So that's kind of what I thought.
Thank you for sharing. What else came up for people? I'd love to hear from everyone else in the room. The mic's going right to you, so you're going to have to be ready. Yeah, I know. She had this look of, no, oh, there you go, okay. Okay, there you go, fine.
Hi.
Hello.
So I think something that everyone can really relate to in the what identity did you earn, I think as designers, we take a lot of identity in our creativity and of the amount of work that we put in our projects and our careers. And that is something that I take a lot of pride in, and I feel like I earned that.
Wonderful, thank you for sharing. Back to you now.
Turn it upside down.
Please share as much as you wish. Okay, go for it.
Okay, well, I'm hogging the mic, but I'll speak anyway.
Go ahead.
Okay, so the identity one, that was placed on me was one that sort of really hit me because I had to think about what that identity was. And when I mentioned to my group that my parents put this inherent trust in me from the day I was born. I was the oldest of three. And I kind of took that with a little bit of swagger, like I'm a pretty cool guy. I got 100% support from my parents. And then I kind of messed around a little bit. And then I realized, you know what, they put this immense responsibility on me, and I started feeling guilty. And I kind of changed my behavior and my attitude because of their perceptions of me and how I was to be perceived in society.
I think birth order plays an enormous role in how you are and who you are. I'm the youngest. My wife is the oldest. I can't understand how she does it half the time. I'm looking at her in awe because she has all this stuff placed on her. She also gets away with a whole bunch of stuff because she's the first. But it's like, it's hard for me to relate to it because it's a completely different life than the one I had. But I think birth order is hugely impactful. We're going to move on to the next set of questions. And I want you to stay in your groups just so we can save some time. I should have mentioned you're going to get to know this person you're talking to very well by the end of this. Next one, power transfer. Okay? When was the last time you gave away your power intentionally? When was the last time you lost your power unintentionally? When was the last time you usurped someone else's power? If you're not sure what usurped means, it's basically watching Game of Thrones. Every episode is people usurping power. It means stealing it, taking it, robbing people of power, taking it without their consent. Now, the reason why I've written these questions as whens is because it is definitely happened to you. You just may not have noticed. So it is inevitable that this is going to happen. That's my opinion. So you have 5 minutes to talk in your pairs or groups about those times. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. So I'm just curious, did anyone have any trouble with the questions? Did it all make sense? They're significantly harder than the last set. Most like kids in art school can do the identity one, no problem. But this one can be a real doozy. Also, it doesn't always have to be bad. I should have answered for myself for this. So last time you gave away your power intentionally, try to do that now in my classroom because I used to not do it at all. So I'm now regularly doing it every week. I get to practice that, which is great. The last time I lost my power unintentionally was when I had kids. I did not realize how much I would lose to them. They slay me every time. If they had any idea how much power they had over me, I'd be completely game over. So I'm hiding the fact that they are constantly ruinous to me. Lastly, the last time I usurped someone else's power, I did it through email, and I did it on purpose, and I had to do it because I had to save my team. But it was very much an explicit act. So, love to hear from the room what came up for you. You don't even have to have the mic. You could just raise your hand. Nobody want to say anything? Yes, please. Oh, look, we can use the mic. Great. Thank you for sharing.
Regarding the last time I lost my power unintentionally, this happened when I intern at SF MoMA, and I'm the only international people there, and every people around me is native speaker, and I feel like I was unintentionally not feel confident of myself, and I didn't show all the skills and ability I have.
I think one's accent can actually surprisingly affect how people show up and how you're read. I don't know if you may have realized how much that may have affected sort of your ability to communicate and be heard as compared to native speakers in the country that you're in. Again, because of this British accent, I didn't realize how much power that came with it. If I knew, I would have moved here sooner. But it's the kind of thing that has nothing to do with you or me, but it was just there. And it's a surprise how much that can affect, whether it's any number of different sort of dialects and languages. But I think it's a surprisingly powerful thing that happens in the classroom a lot. I know at the art school that I teach in, the classroom dialogue skews towards North Americans who speak English, which means that those who are of Asian countries, for instance, they look smaller. They look like they read like they're not contributing, which is not true. But I think that the classroom does not know how to handle, teachers that are in classrooms don't know how to handle those situations because they know only how to register in one channel. So thank you for sharing. What else came up? Katie? How about you guys?
Sure.
Just a nudging.
I thought one of the interesting things was when I first saw the question of when have you usurped someone's power, I even saw myself trying to answer it more from the far left question of like the make it a good thing, like when I gave away power intentionally, which is something I'm really proud of. But for me, the one that came up the most was when was the last time you lost your power unintentionally? And for me, that was related to the times when I wasn't conscious of not speaking up for what I knew was right. And it has to do with a lot with my identity, my privilege as a able-bodied white male. And I just recognize all the times where I could have said something and I gave away my power by not saying anything, but that wasn't a choice because I wasn't being present to it. So that was a powerful question for me.
Thank you very much for sharing.
Yeah.
Anyone else? This is good stuff, guys. You guys are doing great. All right, are you ready for the last one? We're going to try, we might run over just by a minute or two because I want to be done by 11, but we're going to just run over. The last one, power in context. Okay, last one. There's only 2 questions. On whose shoulders do you stand on? And who's standing on your shoulders? 5 minutes. Okay, so that was the last set. I'd love to hear from people what came up. Yeah, yes.
Your discussion is how, so she is a teacher at Academy of Art, and she feels she's standing on the shoulder of the students. That reminds me of what my thesis teacher told me all the time, because there's a lot of international students here, and we do projects based on the Asian culture, and the teacher here we mutually educate each other by my instructor told me, you guys bring a lot of culture background here, and we educate each other. And she feels her education and the whole teacher here are based on the European model and the American culture. Sometimes it's hard for them to understand what's the core issue happens Asia or Arabic. So those international community here, we work together, and we don't know we are also supporting them by when they appreciate that vocally.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of professors who are about the same age as me who are working as professional teachers who simply have not been trained to understand cultural competencies that are significantly different than the one that they grew up in as a whole. And that perhaps in their teacher training, they learned to be a good teacher, but the biases that came along with it was that everyone speaks English, everyone raises their hand, and that everyone is an individual, and God damn it, that's your American right. If you didn't raise in North America, that may not be true. If you're an English person like I am, like I think I am, you tend to be demure. You tend to not shout a lot. I have to constantly practice speaking at a certain volume. It's very tiring for me. If you also are Asian, you may want to defer judgment on who to speak first, depending on who's oldest in the room. There are all these sort of subtleties that get lost when everyone is kind of going out for themselves, which is the predominant norms here based in North America. So I appreciate your comments, because I think it's It's not often that we talk about it. Anyone else?
Yeah, I don't know. I know that I stand on my parents' shoulders, and I don't know if I have much responsibilities for other people right now. So I don't know what to. I don't really have a good answer for this question, I guess.
I think there may be people standing on your shoulders that you may not realize right now. I think when I took this question myself, I realized it was very unsettling. I found that there may be people standing on me that I wasn't paying attention to, and that perhaps I might be being watched, or that perhaps my motion, my being, will add stability to others, perhaps in some cases instability to others, that I wasn't even aware of. That's, I think, one of the things that comes up with a question like this. Okay, so I think we are done. I want to thank you very much for letting me play along with this and with me. I wanted to change the format of how talks often go, because I think there's a lot of power asymmetry in how a speaker, the single point of attention in the front of the room, with this entire room of people who are all knowledgeable, all expert in their own lives, typically goes. And I wanted to remind you all that you have enormous content, enormous expertise, enormous knowledge about yourselves. And unless I deliberately try to change how that dynamic goes, we might be left with the idea that there's always going to be this third-party guru that's at the front of the room, which is just simply not true. So I'm going to leave you with this one thought, which is, when given away, power generates power. And I think whenever possible, we will try to see if we can practice that. Because I think right now, a lot of people assume power is a zero-sum game. For you to gain, I have to lose. For me to gain, I have to steal it from you. And I think it's just simply not true. Thank you very much.